First of all, I only generally like snow if I go to it. If it comes to me, it's a major inconvenience.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
So here's my story. Last night, my mother called me very, very worried about my plans for addressing the coronavirus.
Your plans?
My plans.
Okay.
And for her, that
like specific to the family, or just like your plans for dealing with it, like broadly in the world?
On a global scale. She'd like to know the contributions I can make for this worldwide pandemic.
Okay.
But more specifically, she was saying, well, look, I think you should be really concerned about this. I don't think you should just dismiss it. So what are you doing about it? And I said, I'm nothing. What do you mean? And she said, well, I just want to know, do you have a plan for like the firm? Have you given leave to people? Are you telling them not to come in? And what is Alex doing? What is Nikki doing? And I said, look, Nikki's in Oregon. She's still going to go to the airport and she's going to fly home in a metal tube. Alex is still going to high school. I'm not canceling any meetings. But there were two things that came out of that conversation that I wanted to raise today. The first one is, I'm not even sure they're related thematically, but
God forbid.
God forbid. But the first one is I handled the conversation badly because really what she wanted to hear, which would have cost me nothing, was, yep, I'm all over. We're watching it. I'm making sure to be cautious, et cetera, et cetera.
Which probably isn't not true.
No, it's not.
I mean, like you came to the conclusion that nothing needs to be done at the moment, but that wasn't because you didn't consider it.
No, that's true.
Right.
But I could have handled it better. I should have considered what she needed to take away from that conversation that would have cost me nothing. So that was one small takeaway. But the larger takeaway was the really interesting interplay at work between what I understand is the American culture of being a hero through attendance, powering through sickness, making sure you are present, making sure that, because a sick day is a weakness, yes, or a day off, a mental health day, whatever, is a weakness. So powering through it on the other hand, or on the one hand. On the other hand, you do have your workforce, many people are concerned, whether or not there's been an outbreak in your particular state. If one of if the person in the cubicle or the office next to you is developing this severe cough or something, you can't help but start thinking about this problem. And so what do you do as an employer? Are you proactive and saying, look, although we make money or we fulfill our mission if you're present and you're working, do we give liberal leave? Do we tell people to stay home? Do we send a message that only essential people need report? Do we adopt a plan of how we're going to work virtually? Right. Not because necessarily there's a threat in your particular jurisdiction of coronavirus, right, but there may be a concern and a distraction for your workforce. And how does that play into whether it's your paid time off or just the hero culture of coming in when it's just a tickle in your throat? Right.
Yeah, no, I think this has been coming up a lot at a lot of the clients where I talk. And I think there's a couple layers to it that should not be conflated together. And this topic that we're talking about, this virus, which is currently on everyone's mind. However, I think that this applies metaphorically to all sorts of things that happen in a company and that you have to plan for and think about. Because the things that I don't think should be conflated is you should have a plan in general for what you do if you can't go about business as usual. For instance, when I worked at the architecture firm, actually shortly after I had left the architecture firm, but because my husband is still there, I ended up helping out with this because I was home. We had one of those, it was either a hurricane or maybe it was the derecho, I don't remember what it was, but it was some sort of big wind event that took out electric like across the city.
Okay.
And so our house and also the architecture firm, they were without electric at the office for like a full week, I think it was. It may have even been closer to 10 days.
Wow,
it was
that's
a
a long
lot
time. Yeah.
of time. So what's interesting is at that point, there wasn't a plan for like what we do if we can't all come into the office and do a thing. And because there wasn't a plan in place, like I found a text service that we could text everyone, because not everyone had email, but most people were keeping their phones charged.
Mm-hmm.
So I found a way, but then we realized some people we didn't have their current cell phone or whatever. So first we had to like phone tree it out. Like I'd have to, does anybody have so-and-so's with the text messages I already had, and slowly compile everybody's cell phone numbers, get them all loaded into this thing so we could send out these mass texts about this or that or how to log in from afar. And so we were scrambling in the moment. I'm literally sitting on my front porch with my cell phone, and at times sitting in my car so I could charge it, trying to add all these people. I mean, that's a ridiculous way to go about a disaster moment.
No, but it does bring the point that you don't know if you don't have it until you need it and it's not there.
In theory. So like at one of my clients, they were talking this through and they said, look, we already have like a disaster plan. Like, what do we do if we can't come? So really the answer for them is we don't know, which gets to the second thing that I think is the bigger question here. I think there's no harm in having a plan that addresses the basics of what do we do if, our building's not. I mean, look, a tornado just came through Nashville. There are some buildings that aren't there. How do you get in touch with people? Do you want people to work from home? Or if you're not in an industry where that works, like you just have to think it through. And I don't think there's ever harm in that.
Agreed.
The nuances of when do we pull the trigger on saying you can do that thing and that fine balance. This is a tiny bit like that episode we did when my daughter had pneumonia, where, when are you overreacting to a thing? When are you underreacting to a thing? And knowing the difference between the two isn't always a luxury you get ahead of time.
No, and that's true. And so if you take it from coronavirus to the more mundane, so let's say, particularly where we are in Maryland, snow. And I always thought snow was much, first of all, I only generally like snow if I go to it. If it comes to me, it's a major inconvenience. But if it does come to me, if it does, because you think it's pretty, but
no, I grew up driving it. I like it.
But if it comes to me from a work perspective, if it's 2 feet that just comes down, boom, it just lands. You've got 2 feet of snow. You're not going anywhere. Right? Nobody's going anywhere. The problem is if it's like, well, you've got half an inch of snow, but it's still forecast to continue coming down, and you don't know. When do you pull the trigger on having people stay home? Do you rely on them? Which in a professional workforce, you can. People are adults and they can make their own decisions on safety. But then from an employee's perspective, you're like, I don't feel at ease going in, but I know Cheryl's going to come in and that's going to make me look bad, and then I'm going to lose. If everybody stays out, it's like the prisoner's dilemma. If everybody stays out, then the office is closed. But if, 75% of them come in and the other 25 have legitimate safety concerns, but those 25 are penalized. Right.
And I think the snow and I think ice is even the bigger tricky one because, it's like raining, but then all of a sudden the temperature is going to drop and everything will be covered in ice.
Right.
That is legitimately dangerous.
It is.
And so you have to kind of think that through. And there's a huge difference between if the place that you work is more of kind of independent workers who can make that decision for themselves and they're managing their own clients. That's one thing. There are places though where that's not the structure of how it works. You have to say whether or not a person comes in or whether the store is going to be open or not that day. And it really is I don't think this is going to be an episode where we have some here's a tidy answer to all your questions. It's a really, really tricky thing because on the one hand, you don't want to be cavalier about something that actually puts people's safety at risk, whether that's a health issue or a driving in ice or whatever. And the minute, the concerns that come up when you think, oh, well, we'll do this or do that, we're like, well, what about those people who we have not authorized to work from home because they've not been exhibiting, basic responsible behaviors about working from home? And if this was an extended thing, how do we handle that? I mean, it is that sort of, I'm so torn on it because I'm not a fan at all of micromanage. I'm not a fan of assuming that people will take advantage if they can. And yet there are some people who will get a little loosey-goosey on, well, they said we could stay home, so I'm going to hang out at home.
Right. So in my world, it's a lot easier because I get the luxury, like you said, people work independently, they have their own client loads, et cetera. And I can say, well, you're all adults. Make a decision that's for your safety. And I don't really keep track too much of time off or whatever. But that's not the reality for a lot of businesses. And we don't have walk-ins. People aren't really coming to and go, oh, they're closed.
You can easily work from home. You can have the phones forwarded. You can access everything.
We have documents in the cloud. We have all of that stuff.
If you're in one of those industries, just be thankful because it's so much easier when that is an easy answer, easy path to go down.
Right. The more difficult path is if you're an employer that's faced with the thought of, you should have made it in. You could have made it in.
Yes.
And then are you saying that, look, it's not like it's pneumonia, it's just bronchitis. You should have come in.
I know.
Or are you saying that I made it in?
Yeah. So when I was running that bison company, I there were days where, because I like drive, I'm not daunted by driving in ice and snow. I grew up in West Virginia.
You grew up in mountain country.
I grew up in mountain company. I literally live on this like huge hill. I learned to drive on a very icy, lots of snow, really steep hill. Getting up, it's almost scarier than getting back down.
But that freaks some people out.
It freaks some people out. And the thing I had to, in that situation, because I'll be honest, when somebody was like, oh, it's going to be a little icy tomorrow, there's a part of me that was very unkind and
Like, so you have that suck it up buttercup.
The thoughts in my hand, the thoughts in my head were not compassionate, but I did have to step back and say, like, look, the last person I want driving on icy roads is someone who doesn't feel confident driving on icy roads. That's a double whammy, scary, danger kind of thing. So that was a little bit easier. It is super tricky with this kind of thing because I've even thought about it on my own. I can do most of what I do. I do a lot of what I do remotely. There are some clients I've never met face-to-face that I only talk to on the phone. So I could totally do most of what I do. And what will be interesting is if there are moments where I start to feel like I should stay home and like dial in, but say the entire leadership team that I'm working with is there in person. Yeah. And I will struggle with my own need to be the person who isn't daunted by things. You know, I mean, that's absolutely a motivator for me. And it'll be an interesting kind of balance.
No, and so some people that I've seen will have a default solution, which is if Baltimore County schools are closed.
Sure.
You know, then you don't come in. Now you have to be comfortable with that standard because Baltimore County closes for wind. But
Baltimore County does cover a really wide swath.
It does. It covers a wide
areas,
swath.
So,
for us, you know, on occasion we've tied it to the courts. If the courts are closed for weather, because the federal courts rarely close for weather, so you can be comfortable with that. It's
you can, but basically it means that you don't have to figure it out. You're saying like I found a foil. Like,
yes, I have
someone else.
Well, you also don't have to worry about the phone tree, and people can find out independently, and you don't worry about missing somebody.
Yep.
And there's no, well, geez, is Cheryl coming in? Because if she comes in, then I'm going to look back. You've got an objective standard. Yep. This is it.
Yep. Yeah. And you're making it clear for people so that you don't have people, which I think is a really interesting thing because way bigger than this virus. I think I was having a conversation with someone the other day about the really unfortunate place that anybody is in who is in an industry or has to make decisions where you are stopping a thing from happening because there's no thanks or love in that. So
no, nobody recognizes a successful deterrent.
Right, exactly, precisely. So, you know, everyone, I would love to see statistics of these like few months later down the road. I bet you, because everyone's so super hyper-focused on hand washing and not touching your face and whatnot, I bet the number of colds and bronchitis and strep throat and flu and everything plummet this like time, like right now in this couple, but because people are doing these preventative things they should be doing anyway, but apparently aren't because it's such a big deal now. And if doing those things, I just think I get really deeply frustrated when, you know, you can say something's not a big deal and maybe it's not a big deal. But by doing the preventative care, you may actually keep it from becoming a big deal. And then lots of people will get to say, see, it was never a thing. I mean, this is a really morbid example and it's super dramatic, but I can't think of a better one quickly enough. But I have often thought about, because here's what we know. Post 9/11, if ever there were planes in the air that were known hijacked, terrible decision to have to make, but they would probably shoot them down, knowing what is possible.
Yes.
But prior to that, had they shot them down, that would have been just uproar,
global recrimination,
absolute uproar for shooting down planes of civilians, and everyone would have said, "What's the worst they could have done? They would have maybe crashed in a building, and those couple of floors of people would have." It's not like the whole building would come down. Until a thing happens, you can't know for sure if there's a risk or not. And I just those kinds of decisions are really tricky.
No, they are. And actually you said it was a morbid example, but that makes a lot of sense, because the example that I came up with was from
when you have a donut.
It was actually, and I think it was from Freakonomics or something, which is that the murder rate in New York City went down dramatically in the late 80s through the mid 90s. And the correlation is from the the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, because
Wait, what?
Yeah, because the statistics are, if abortion is legal and accessible,
okay,
then there are fewer unwanted children.
Okay.
Those children don't grow up without parental supervision or the support system around them.
Okay.
And so they don't commit the crimes in their teens
that
and
seems
early
like a
20s.
Gigantic leap of correlative.
Yes, it is. But you don't, the point is, a lot of times you don't see what the deterrent is. You don't see what the effect of the deterrent is. And with anything from coronavirus to Y2K, whatever, if you have all your preparations for it, anybody's free to say, well, it's no big deal. You never had to do that in the first place.
Right. Exactly.
But the issue is, okay, so you can deal with snow days. You can even kick the can or pass the baton to somebody else to make the decision. If district courts are closed or if schools are closed, then you're not coming in. But if you need to be open for your customers and you want people to come in and be responsible, it doesn't matter whether they're really tired or hungover or it's inconvenient or they wish they couldn't come in. You want to create a culture where people take the responsibility of coming in very seriously. And now you have this thing, the health scare, where people are being judged for coming in and they're being judged for not coming in.
Well, there's actually two layers here. I mean, there's judged, and then there is simply can't go without my hourly pay from this time. You know, if there is, I mean, it's one thing if there's a whole community-wide shutdown. I mean, this will be very interesting if it begins to play out more thoroughly, as some people expect, where you have to use a completely different structure for your business decision-making skills than you have ever been asked to use before. So because shutting down your restaurant for a day or two or a week or 2 weeks could be the end for a lot of businesses are right on the edge most of the time.
Yes.
And so being shut down for a week or 2 weeks or a month would put a lot of people out of business. You know, there are some really big deterrents, and yet, so normally that's your like highest priority of what do I have to do to keep this thing going. And yet this is going to interject a potentially larger scale decision-making process. But let's say the restaurant or business stays open. In some places it's more about judgment. You're like, well, Carol will be there, so I need to be there. In other places, it's I can't do without my hourly pay, and that it sort of topples the whole priority of decision-making.
Yeah, it does. It does. So I think from the employer point of view, you can figure out, what does this look like? So if somebody is legitimately, if you're worried about somebody just taking advantage of the situation, if they are legitimately worried that this thing that they have might be contagious, might be coronavirus or whatever, what does that look like? Well, if you're legitimately worried, then you would probably go to at least a patient first or some sort of doctor or something like that. And so maybe you say, okay, we'll accept your word. We'll take you at your word that you're worried about this health thing, but you have to show us that you acted consistent with that and you just didn't take a sick day. For a snow day or something like that, if you make it easy for people to report their concern, you can consider an alternate path, which is Maybe we just have an Uber budget and we send them an Uber and
with
or we send them a Lyft.
Potentially good driver in the snow.
Yeah, right. I don't know if I know Uber has like the XL or Uber X or something like that. I wonder if they have Uber 4-wheel or whatever.
I don't know.
But you can make your plans for people who live close together and somebody has a 4-wheel or somebody has this. But the point is to address it before it becomes a thing, and then figure out how are we best going to deal with it from the employer side of getting what we need out of people, and the employee side from overcoming the culture of being a hero when there's a health risk, taking them at their word to a certain extent, and preventing any kind of taking advantage.
Yeah, and I think it's useful. It's a great time to kind of back up the question a couple steps and really investigate your own thought processes on how much in your particular industry and your particular office is working from home a problem. Because if people still have results they have to get to,
right.
I've had a number of clients who just will not entertain work from home options. And I'll be honest, from the outside, they don't have a legitimate reason. They're not in an industry where people have walk-ins. They're not in an industry where highly collaborative. Like architecture is a little tricky because if you're a team or any kind of design thing, there is a lot of collaborative kind of working all together. It still can be done totally, but with so many collaborative tools now. But I think it's an opportunity to really question whether it's a problem or not, because a lot of times the real answer, if they're completely honest, is I just like to have my eyeballs on people so I know they're working.
Well, that and even in my world, there are a lot of collaborative tools, but I think that a lot of the best work takes place in the blank spaces. When you catch somebody in the hall, or let me run this past you, or what have you. That's not just on, let's say, a Google Docs, and everybody can see the collaboration. So there is, and also, as my son would say, okay, boomer. I do operate better face to face. I take a comfort in that. I can do the remote, I can do the collaborative online, et cetera. But I do have a better work result if I'm sitting with somebody and we're talking about this thing, whatever it is, this trial strategy or this contract paragraph, when we're face to face, as opposed to online.
There are definitely some benefits to it, but that is a finer line than we can't ever have anybody work
No,
from
absolutely.
home.
It wouldn't be a preclusion.
It's not a preclusion. I do think there is something unique about this, though, because there may be decisions that have to be made that are, in the coming months that are so much less clear than like, okay, if this person thinks they're sick, because we're just talking about the flu or pneumonia, then yes, if you really think you're sick, go to the doctor. Then you have a note. That's a way to sort of vet things.
Sure.
One of the issues with this particular virus is, again, a little bit morbid, but sometimes there are two factors. There's how contagious a thing is, and then how deadly a thing is. And sometimes I was reading this thing from a Hopkins infectious disease guy. He said, sadly, things that don't kill people are actually sometimes worse and end up killing more people because, to be very frank about it, the dead don't go walking around contaminating other people. And so they call it a long tail, that if or thin tail, or I think it's a thin tail, whatever, it doesn't matter.
It's tail oriented.
It's tail oriented of some descriptive quality. And the fact that people can be walking around for 5 or 6 weeks infecting people and not even know that they have a thing. And so there may be decisions that come up so far in advance of having any of that like gut feeling that you're making the right decision, that you'll have to decide whether or not you do a thing. I often think about what it must be like to have to decide on recall situations.
Oh, product recall?
Yeah, product recall of any kind. And, if we think of really dramatic ones, obviously if, think of like some of the ones over the years of like Tylenol when some kids died. It's like that first one comes in, and obviously you want to react because you're like, oh, a child died. You're like, but do we know for sure it was our thing? Like, and then where is that line? Or if you've got a thing. Now, what I'm not talking about here is where there are intentional complicit cover-ups of things so that they don't have to put bad news out of the thing. But
But there was a story coming out. I know we have to wrap this up, but there was a story coming out.
It's our show. We can do whatever we want, Elliot. We can keep talking forever.
An hour and a half. So the Steve Jobs, I think Isaacson. Anyway, the Steve Jobs autobiography. Or biography, I'm sorry, where they were talking about a problem with one of the early iPhones where the way people were holding the iPhone was interfering with the reception that the iPhone was getting for some reason.
Interesting.
And so that was the set of facts they were dealing with. And Steve Jobs' initial reaction when this was brought to his attention, because you had all these iPhones out there.
Right.
And all these complaints about reception was that that's a customer problem. Tell them to hold it differently. And that was his initial reaction. Mm-hmm. And then they had a subsequent meeting, whatever. And he's like, okay, well, that's wrong. I can't just say my customers are using the product wrong. And so many of them are using it wrong. We've got to figure out how to fix it. So he had to go from the initial defensiveness, saying it's not serious enough because a recall would be tremendous and was tremendously expensive to have them repair all these things. So he went defensive first and then had to look at it and say, okay, how can we do this better and how do we fix it?
Yeah. And just to kind of close up on this, it's funny. My parents, much to their credit, they very much, I started to say led us, but this is kind of my whole point, forced us to make a lot of our own decisions about things. I can remember being very tiny and trying, maybe like 4th or 5th grade and deciding whether I went on this school field trip or whether I auditioned for Annie in the school play. And my parents would not, they would help me talk it through, but they would not make decisions for us about things. And I remember, again, relatively early, I wasn't maybe like middle school or something. And one of my friends saying like, oh, you're so lucky. Your parents like let you make your own decisions. And even at that age, I was like, oh no. It's not all it's cracked up to be. Because it is, making decisions is weighty. And it's great if you have a really clear choice. I am choosing between chocolate ice cream and vanilla ice cream. But it's many of the things that come in front of you as a leader or as a business owner or just as a grown-up in general are it's like you have 2 black boxes and they might be varying degrees of bad or potentially not so bad. And you don't want to overreact. You don't want to underreact. And it is not clear. And you have to make choices with limited information, with unknowns abound. And that's one of the prices of leading a thing or being a grown-up.
But I do think I think that what we really came down to in many respects is that
nothing substantive.
No, I think that for these things, not only is it collaborative because there's decision making on both sides. You can break it down employer-employee, but I like the word that you used with when you were talking about decision making is weighty. And I think that as long as both sides understand that it is collaborative, and as long as both sides appreciate that this decision that they're making has weight, has heft, and is not to be made frivolously, maybe.
And with just whatever stack of old rules you have sitting around for how you make decisions. Yeah. Like everybody has to come to work unless they're dying. Well,
but so there's a degree of latitude provided that everybody knows that their decision has weight.
I would just add one last thing to that is I would want to, especially in situations like this, expand a little bit I don't know if I want to say expand the feeling of being right, but there is, I think what can get in the way of this is this white knuckle hold on, I don't want to be wrong, I don't want to look like an idiot. Right. To know that like, look, right, and I'm making air quotes, right is just the best you can do in the moment. And we're going to make decisions and they may or may not turn out the way we thought they would, but we're sort of aiming for least regrets possible.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village,
Yes, it does.
we'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky
Ooh,
team.
yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of
Lovingly
ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Including wrangling us.
Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.